Part 4: The Kabbalah and the Crafted Narrative. This next section is different from everything that has come before it. Up to now, the focus has been on texts, history, and arguments you can track step by step. This part shifts away from that a bit, and it may not be for everyone. If you're mainly interested in textual issues, manuscripts, variants, dating, you may find this section harder to stay engaged with. But if you're interested in how narratives are shaped, who controls them, and what assumptions sit behind them, or just conspiracies in general, then this is where things start to open up. What we're stepping into here is not just evidence, but mindset, specifically the mindset of those who influence and maintain dominant narratives, and what happens when you follow that mindset to where it naturally leads. That means asking questions about recurring patterns and why someone would operate around such patterns. In the process of writing these chapters, I spent time going through various strands of occult literature, and I'm not going to dress that up. A lot of it is very dorky, and then at other times is very dark. I don't find it is something to take lightly. There is a reason that kind of material has the reputation it does. It's difficult to put into words what makes it so profoundly disturbing. It's not the perverted ritual sex magic or human sacrifices. It is something so much more basic. It is the desire of hidden knowledge, or gnosis. The one thing I saw in common with everything I was reading was this hatred for these global. It is. Bleh. The one thing I saw in common with everything I was reading was this hatred by these global leaders and occultists had towards stupid people who are easily content being in their stupid state. The deeper I went into it, the more obvious it became that going too far into that direction can put one in a dark place. It takes you to a state of mind where you hate humanity at a level that makes you sick to your stomach. After observing the behavior of these demoniacs and reading much of the literature that influences them, I have to conclude that the peak of this so called gnosis leads to nothing else but self loathing and genocide. The first version of these chapters reflected much of this evil. They went much further into that material, quoted from it heavily, and followed those lines of thoughts in detail. In the end, I scrapped and rewrote large portions of it, not because the connections weren't there, but because the material itself is too dark to lay out in full, and it doesn't need to be explored in depth to make the point. So I leaned more heavily on the dorky side of it. What you're reading now is a more restrained version. The argument is still there, but without going deep into literature that frankly is better left alone. After eh, trying to understand the minds of the most evil people on the planet is not as much fun as it sounds. Take that as a warning more than anything else. There's no real benefit in immersing yourself in that kind of material. The purpose of these chapters is not to pull you into that world, but to push you to think differently about the one you're already in. Everyone operates within a framework, assumptions, boundaries, expectations that shape how we understand things. Most of the time, we don't even realize it's there. So think of this section as an attempt to step outside of that, even if just for a moment. Not to replace one framework with another, but to test it, to see what holds up and what doesn't when you start asking different kinds of questions. You don't have to agree with where it leads. That's not the goal. The goal is simply to give you something to wrestle with, something that stays with you and forces you to think a little deeper than you might have before. Chapter 20: Kabbalah and Hermetics. Kabbalah and gematria are frequently misunderstood, especially in popular or polemical treatments, as little more than games of arithmetic, systems in which letters are assigned numerical values and words are then compared, manipulated, or manifested through calculation. While such practices undoubtedly exist and have a long pedigree within Jewish and occult traditions, they represent only the outermost shell of a far deeper intellectual system. To focus on letter-number substitution alone is to mistake the surface technique for the governing logic beneath it. At its core, Kabbalistic numerology is concerned not with letters but with numbers as structure. Number functions as metaphysical grammar, an underlying architecture through which reality is believed to be generated, ordered, stabilized, and most importantly, acted upon. It is this framework, numbers do not merely describe the world, they participate in its formation. They are not symbolic add-ons to meaning, but the scaffolding upon which meaning itself is built. Within this worldview, number precedes language. Letters are secondary phenomena, vessels that clothe numerical principles already at work. Meaning does not arise first from words or narratives, but from proportion, sequence, balance, and rhythm. Reality is intelligible because it is structured, and it is structured because it is numerical. Speech, text, and symbol are therefore downstream expressions of an already ordered system. This assumption reversed the more familiar biblical and philosophical emphasis on speech as the primary creative act. In an occult Kabbalistic reading, creation is mathematics before it is utterance. Order exists prior to articulation. The spoken word does not summon reality into being so much as activate, reveal. Let's try that again. The spoken word does not summon reality into being so much as active, reveal, or direct forces that are already numerically encoded. Language is thus a tool of access rather than a point of origin. This chapter proceeds from that premise. It explains the symbolic and operational role of numbers, particularly 6 and 7 within Kabbalistic and broader occult thought. These numbers are not threats or not treated as isolated curiosities, but as long-bearing elements within a wider metaphysical system. 6 governs expression, labor, and material engagement. 7 governs complication, stabilization, and continuity. Together they form a recurring numerical logic that appears across Kabbalistic Hermeticism, ritual theory, and modern occult practice. To situate this discussion properly, this chapter also introduces the broader Hermetic framework that both parallels and reinforces Kabbalistic number theory. Hermeticism does not merely borrow symbols from Jewish mysticism, it formalizes a shared assumption that reality is intelligible, governable, and reproducible through fixed principles. Number becomes the bridge between thought and matter, between will and outcome. Closely related to this is the concept of manifestation, understood here not in its modern self-help form, but in its classical occult sense, the discipline of alignment of mind, symbol, number, and action in order to produce material effects. In such systems, belief is not a moral virtue, but a functional mechanism. Numbers matter because they regulate timing, sequence, repetition, and proportion, the mechanics through which intention is translated into reality. The unifying assumption guiding this analysis is that these ideas are not merely abstract mysticism or intellectual curiosities, they form part of a coherent and historically persistent tradition that has influenced the way power, order, and meaning are conceptualized. Over time, this numerical worldview has moved outward from speculative metaphysics into ritual, from ritual into institutions, and from institutions into political and ideological structures. It is within this broader context that modern projects, including the modern nation state of Israel, can be understood as operating consciously or unconsciously within an inherited symbolic architecture shaped by numbers, rhythm, and order. The claim here is not yet historical or evidentiary, it is structural. The task of this chapter is to lay the conceptual groundwork necessary to recognize such patterns when they are explained concretely. The historical argument for how, when, and by who these ideas were transmitted and operationalized will be addressed in a later chapter. Here, the focus remains foundational. Before institutions can be analyzed, the grammar that makes them intelligible must be established. Before symbols can be decoded, numerical logic beneath them must be made visible. What follows then is not an expose, but an excavation, a careful outline of the numerical architecture that sits beneath language, theology, and power, often unseen, rarely questioned, yet remarkably consistent across traditions that otherwise appear unrelated. What follows is an oversimplification of a very complex system, and I have intentionally excluded many of the darker mechanisms for the sake of keeping this book kid friendly, or how the Bible puts it in Ephesians 5:12, quote, "For it is a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret." End quote. Within Kabbalistic numerological Within Kabbalistic numerology, 6 is the number of creation and process. It represents extension into space, multiplicity, and material formation. Rather than signifying origin or completion, 6 marks the phase in which structure is actively unfolding. It is the number of engagement where form is imposed upon matter in order and extended and order is extended outward. Structurally, 6 corresponds to the full range of created extension, the 6 directions of space: north, south, east, west, up, down. The 6 days of creation, the 6 lower seraphites that govern the active world. These correspondences reinforce one another. The 6 directions describe the total reach of the physical space. The 6 days describe the temporal unfolding of creation. The 6 lower seraphites, however you say that, describe the channels through which divine energy operates within the material realm. In each case, 6 governs activity rather than finality. It is concerned with expansion, differentiation, and productive motion. 6, therefore, is power without rest. It is motion, expansion, productivity, and engagement with matter. In occult thought, it represents the world as something malleable, something to be shaped, mastered, and engineered. Through knowledge, technique, and will, reality under this framework is not static, it is responsive to intellectual effort. From an occultist reading of Scripture, this principle is encoded mathematically in the creation narrative and reiterated in the command concerning labor. In Exodus 20, verse 9, quote, 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, end quote. Viewed through this lens, the verse is not primarily moral or covenantal, it is structural. 6 governs action, work, and the assertion of will upon reality. It defines the dominion in which productive activity occurs and which creative authority is exercised. This also explains the inherited tension within the numbers. 6 creates, but it does not complete. It builds, but it does not stabilize. It expands order, yet it leaves that order unfinished. For this reason, 6 appears repeatedly in esoteric systems as the number of human creative authority, sometimes exalted as participation in the act of creation, sometimes inverted as power exercised without rest, restraint, or final resolution. If 6 is creation in motion, 7 is creation stabilized. Where 6 governs activity and expression, 7 governs resolution and containment. It does not introduce new creative force, it brings what already exists into balance. 7 represents completion, rest, sacred order, and cylindrical closure. In Kabbalistic thought, 7 does not negate 6, it contains it. The work of 6 is not undone, but gathered, integrated, and secured. 6 builds, 7 seals. Without 7, creation remains open-ended and unstable. With 7, it becomes coherent and durable. The Zohar describes 7 days. The Zohar describes the seventh day not merely as cessation of labor, but as the sovereignty itself. In Zohar 2:88a, quote, what does the word Sabbath mean? The name of the Holy One, the name in which is perfect harmony at all sides. End quote. Here rest is not inactivity, it is authority. The Sabbath represents the moment when all active forces are brought under an underlying order. The system no longer expands; it holds power. Power shifts from production to preservation. From an occultist interpretive framework, the biblical Sabbath functions as a metaphysical locking mechanism. In Genesis 2:2, quote, and on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested. End quote. Read esoterically, this is not fatigue, it is finalization. The act of resting signals that the structure is complete. The architecture no longer requires adjustment. What was in motion is now fixed in form. In numerological systems, 7 governs the stabilization of time and meaning. It is associated with sacred time, ritual cycles, and institutional continuity. 7 structures representation. It marks cycles that return, renew, and reaffirm order. This is why 7 appears so frequently in calendars, festivals, rites, and legal rhythms. It allows power not merely to be exercised, but to endure. Where 6 is productive energy, 7 is regulated equilibrium. It transforms motion into prominence, expansion into governance, action into structure. Thus, 6 is revolution, 7 is regime. I promise all this stupidity ties back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Western occultism, particularly Hermeticism, formalizes this numerical worldview through what are commonly known as the 7 Hermetic principles. These principles are most famously articulated in the Kabbalion, a modern text that presents itself as a synthesis rather than an innovation. While the book's language is contemporary, the conceptual framework it codifies draws upon much older streams of thought, including Platonic philosophy, Egyptian priestly speculation, and Pythagorean number theory and Jewish mystical tradition. What distinguishes Hermeticism is not the invention of new symbols, but the systemization of reality itself. Where Kabbalah often speaks in mystic, symbolic, and narrative forms, Hermeticism recasts metaphysical assumptions as universal laws. Reality is no longer merely contemplated, it is diagrammed. The 7 Hermetic principles are presented as comprehensive and exhaustive laws that govern all levels of existence. 1. Mentalism. The all is mind. Reality is foundationally mental. Material phenomena are expressions of an underlying intellectual or conscious substrate, rather than independent substance. 2. Correspondence. As above, so below. Structures repeat across levels of reality, allowing insight into the whole through examinations of its parts. The cosmic and social and personal mirror one another. 3. Vibration. Nothing rests, everything moves. Difference is explained not by substance but by rate and degree of motion. Stability is only apparent. 4. Polarity. Opposites are not true contradictions but extremes on a single continuum. Light and dark, good and evil, hot and cold differ only by degree, not essence. 5. Rhythm. All things rise and fall in pattern cycles. Movement follows oscillation rather than linear progression. What ascends what ascends will descend, what expands will contract. 6. Cause and effect. Nothing happens by chance. Every event is the result of prior conditions, whether perceived or hidden. Randomness is a function of ignorance, not reality. And 7. Gender. Masculine and feminine principles operate in all things. Generation, interaction, and manifestation require polarity and cooperation rather than isolation. Taken together, these principles form a closed metaphysical circuit. Nothing exists outside them. Nothing escapes their logic. 7 functions here not simply as a number, but as a boundary. The system is complete. It does not point beyond itself. This is where Hermeticism is aligned so closely with Kabbalistic number theory, just as 7 is in Kabbalah represents completion and stabilization. The 7 Hermetic principles presents a worldview in which reality is fully accounted for. Origin, motion, balance, repetition, causation, and generation are all addressed. There is no remainder. Importantly, these principles are not framed as matters of faith. They are operational assumptions. They are meant to be applied rather than believed, tested rather than confessed. Hermeticism treats understanding at leverage. To know the laws is to work with them. To work with them is to gain influence over outcomes. In this sense, Hermeticism transforms metaphysics into technique. Knowledge becomes a form of control. The universe is no longer a mystery to be submitted to, but a system to be navigated. 7 marks the point at which explanation becomes sufficient for action. This is why number 7 is so persistent in occult systems. It signals not merely holiness or symbolism, but functional completeness. When a system reaches 7, it claims authority. It asserts that nothing essential has been left out. In occult systems, manifestation is not understood as optimism, imagination, or positive thinking. It is a technique process. The world does not respond to desire, it responds to structured intent. What matters is not what is hoped for, but how will it organize how well but how it will. I think that should be well, not will. Let's fix that. But how well is organized, expressed and enacted. At its core, manifestation is the discipline aligned of 4 elements: mind, the conceptual of intent; symbol, the language through which intent is encoded; number, the structure that orders and stabilizes the process; and action, the physical execution that anchors intent in reality. Each element is necessary, none is sufficient on its own. Thought without symbol remains abstract. Symbol without number lacks constraint. Number without action remains inert. Action without coherence produces noise rather than effect. Within this framework, belief is not treated as a moral virtue or an act of trust. It is a mechanism of condition that allows the system to function without internal resistance. Belief does not generate outcomes, it removes friction. The efficiency of manifestation is attributed not to sincerity but to alignment. Aleister Crowley, captured this understanding in a frequently cited formulation in Magic in Theory and Practice. Quote, magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. End quote. The emphasis here is deliberate. Magic is framed as a science because it claims repeatability and lawfulness, and as an art because it requires skill, timing, and judgment. Change is not random, and it is not miraculous. It is produced when will is brought into conformity with the underlying structure of reality. Number governs this process by supplying the structure. Repetition is counted, timing is measured, sequence are ordered, proportions are calibrated. Nothing essential is left to chance. Numerical frameworks determine how often an action is performed, when it is performed, and in what arrangement. In this sense, numbers function as the grammar of manifestation. This is why occult rituals are saturated with counts, cycles, and fixed intervals. The symbol repeated once is an expression repeated multiple times. It becomes a system. Numbers do not decorate the act, they stabilize it. They transform intention into procedure. Kabbalistic thought describes manifestation as a downward movement through secutive levels of reality, from thought, where intention originates, to word, where intention is articulated, to action, where intention is enacted, and to the material outcome, where intention is embedded, or embodied, rather. Each stage represents a condensation. What begins as abstraction becomes increasingly constrained until it enters the physical world. Language narrows thought. Action narrows language. Matter narrows action. Number governs this narrowing process by ensuring continuity across levels, preventing collapse or disruption as intent moves downward. For this reason, numbers are treated not as esoteric additions or metaphysical flourishes, but as keys. They unlock transitions between levels, they regulate flows, they ensure that this is conceived about above arrives intact below. Let's try that again. They ensure that what is conceived above arrives intact below. Within the system, reality is not passively observed, it is engineered. Outcomes are approached as the result of design rather than providence. The practitioner does not wait for meaning to appear, meaning is constructed, encoded, and deployed. Manifestation, then, is not about faith in the unseen, it is about the mastery of form. Will becomes effective only when it is numbered, timed, symbolized, and enacted. Without structure, intention dissipates, and with structure, it solidifies. This is the logic that underlines occult manifestation. Reality yields not to desire, but to ordered will. One of the defining characteristics of occult tradition is syncretism, the deliberate blending of distinct religious, philosophical, and symbolic systems into a single functional framework. Occultism does not arise from an unseen lineage or a continuous revelation. It is constructed. Its coherence is architectural rather than historical. Kabbalah as it is at Kabbalah as it appears in its later mystical and occult form is not an isolated development. It draws selectively from multiple intellectual streams. Babylonian cosmology, particularly in its layered heavens, numerological symbolism, and emphasis on asterial influence, Platonic Platonic philosophy, especially concepts of immaterial forms governing material reality. Pyth- Pythagorean number theory, which treats numbers as quantities but as yeah, which treats numbers not as quantities but as metaphysical principles. These elements are not adopted wholesale, they are adopted, reframed, and integrated into a symbolic system that prioritizes structure over narrative and mechanism over covenant. Hermeticism follows a similar pattern of assembly. It presents itself as ancient and unified, but its components are composite. Egyptian priestly systems, especially ritual knowledge guarded by initiation, Greek metaphysics, which provides abstract categories for reality, mind, and causation, and Jewish mysticism, from which it borrows numerical frameworks, symbolic language, and scriptural vocabulary. What emerges is not a continuation of any one tradition, but a hybrid model designed for portability and reuse. Concepts are stripped of their original theological commitments and reinserted into a system whose primary concern is operational effectiveness. Modern occultism inherits this method wholesale. It borrows freely from Kabbalah, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, astrology, alchemy, and Eastern philosophy, often without attribution. I can't say that word. And without regard for historical boundaries. Authority is derived not from origin but from perceived functionality. If a symbol works, it is kept. If it resonates, it is absorbed. The result is not a single tradition, but a layered architecture. Symbols are repurposed across systems. Numbers are recontextualized to serve new frameworks. Narratives are flattened into patterns. Meaning becomes modular. Scripture is thus Scripture in this context undergoes a fundamental transformation. Texts that were originally covenantal, historical, and moral are reread as esoteric manuals. Commandments become techniques. This is why biblical texts appear so frequently in occult literature. They are not treated as revelation or testimony, but as raw material, a symbolic reservoir from which mechanisms can be extracted. For example, Proverbs 18:21, quote, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue," end quote. Under an occult reading, the proverb is not approached as a moral warning about speech, responsibility, or community. It is interpreted mechanically. Speech becomes a causal instrument. Words are treated as force that produces outcome by virtue of their vibration, repetition, or symbolic alignment. In this framework, language does not respond to truth, reality responds to language. The ethical dimension is secondary, if not irrelevant. What matters is efficiency. Syncretism makes this possible by severing symbols from their original context. Occult systems gain flexibility. They are free to recombine elements across cultures and centuries, assembling a toolkit rather than inheriting a tradition. What results is a system that feels ancient, authoritative, and comprehensive, but in practice is engineered. It is not perceived, it is built. And its building blocks are drawn wherever structure, number, and symbols can be made to serve will. Kabbalah and Gematria are not intellectual games or symbolic curiosities. They are systems built on a specific and conceptual assumption that reality is ordered, accused, or accessed rather, and governed through numbers. In this view, number is not a secondary tool used to interpret meaning, it is the framework that makes meaning possible. in the first place. Within such systems, numbers function as organizing principles rather than symbols. They regulate sequence, proportion, repetition, and balance. Language, ritual, and narratives are treated as interfaces that operate within this numerical structure, but as the formation, not as its formation. Meaning is therefore understood to arise from pattern and order before it arises from speech or belief. This assumption has proven remarkably durable. It moves easily from metaphysical speculation into practical application, from mystical text into instrumental forms. Once number is accepted as governing logic, it naturally expresses itself in calendars, legal rhythms, architectural design, and ritual cycles, and systems of authority. What begins as cosmology becomes administration, whether these frameworks represent genuine insight into structure of reality or systematic misreading of it. Let's try that again. Whether these frameworks represent genuine insight into the structure of reality or systematic misreading of it, or a systematic misreading of it, is not a question that this chapter attempts to resolve. The issue at hand is influence, not truth. These ideas have shaped how power understands itself, how order is maintained, and how continuity is preserved, often without being named or consciously acknowledged. To study these systems is not to endorse them, it is to recognize the architecture they provide and to rule and the roles they play in shaping thought and governance. Ignoring that architecture does not remove its effect, it merely renders them invisible. What lies beneath theology, policies, or politics, and symbolism is not silence, but structure, and structure, once established, rarely announces itself. And that's that chapter, and it'll make sense why we went through all that moving forward. The next chapters are kind of weird, kind of stupid, but like I said in the beginning of the chapter, this isn't really for everybody. It's a lot of stupid stuff, but yeah, we're done. How do we end this thing?